Being strong and being explosive are not the same thing. A strong individual is someone who can move something extremely heavy from point A to point B. An explosive individual is somebody capable of running fast, changing direction quickly, and jumping high into the air. They can also deliver snappy punches and throw things long distances. They exert strength, but they do so very quickly. How do you become more explosive then? The first place many people will turn to is plyometric training. However, there's a lot of confusion surrounding what plyometric training actually is and what it isn't. There's even more confusion surrounding how to use it effectively and when to turn to other similar tools. So, let's jump in. Jump, like in plyometric box jumps. Plyometric exercises utilize rapid bursts of power with a minimal ground contact time in order to utilize the stretch-shortening cycle. An example is a counter-movement jump. Here the athlete lowers themselves rapidly, eccentric phase, pauses extremely briefly, amortization phase, then springs up into the air to land on a box or other raised platform, concentric phase. The term plyometric is a little nebulous and open to interpretation, however. The stretch-shortening cycle means that you're lengthening and then contracting the working muscles in a very short time frame. This is something we do intuitively all the time, such as when you wind up a punch. This is often described as being a way to tap into the stored energy that comes from stretching the muscle, like an elastic band. This is incorrect, however. In fact, the power of the stretch-shortening cycle appears to come from the time the muscle spends in the active state. This allows for more cross bridges to form inside the muscles, thereby giving them more traction, as it were, to then exert force. The lengthening phase therefore acts more like a run-up. But spend too long in the stretch position and you'll lose some of that potential because you're no longer active. That's why it's harder and not easier to jump out of a squat unless you just dropped into it very briefly. The former is an isometric concentric movement, the latter is a plyometric concentric movement. This also means that the ground contact time is actually not as important as the time the muscles spend in the active state, thus a counter-movement jump from the ground is still plyometric. That said, there is also benefit to minimizing ground contact time in other scenarios if you want to become truly explosive. Enter the Verkhoshansky depth jump and shock training. The best example is the Verkhoshansky depth jump. This involves jumping off a raised platform around 42 inches for maximum benefit, and then launching back off the ground after less than 0.2 seconds. This collision engages the myotatic stretch response. The sudden lengthening of the muscles causes them to then rapidly contract in response, and this in turn allows the athlete to draw upon huge reserves of explosive strength. This same collision is also seen in sprinting. Over time, practicing this will increase the athlete's eccentric strength, as well as training the central nervous system to anticipate the myotatic reflex and thus increase firing rate. In short, athletes get a lot more explosive, and in one study, volleyball players were shown to gain a 14% increase in jump height using a depth jump program. By the way, if you want to see all the studies that support all this, then head over to the link in the description down below and read the written version of this post. To turn the explosive push-up into an example of shock training, we would need to jump on each repetition while keeping the time on the ground to 0.2 seconds or below, all while properly absorbing the impact to avoid injury. This could translate to even more explosive punching and throwing, and have useful benefit for max bench press. That said, there are also some rebound elements involved in most explosive movements. This is where athletic properties such as ankle stiffness become important. Tendon hysteresis describes how pliable a tendon is, where lower hysteresis equals less pliability. When running, an athlete's calf actually plays a somewhat minimal role during plantar flexion, as a lot of energy is returned by the stiffness of the tendon. Thus, it can make more sense to think of the muscles in terms of muscle tendon units. Fascia, the thin film wrap that covers the muscles, organs and more, which I mention in almost every single video, also has elastic properties and is able to return energy to the ground. Think of it like being coated in a thin layer of flubber. One of the most crucial things to understand when utilizing plyometrics is interserial rest periods, rest times between sets. If you are programming plyometrics or shock training, then you should also include sufficient rest time. This is not quite as straightforward as some vocal individuals on the web would have you believe, however. The argument goes that in order to trigger useful adaptations with plyometrics, you need a long recovery period. This then allows the individual to exert 100% of their max effort during each rep when performing plyometrics. It has been suggested that this should be in the region of 2 to 5 minutes of interset rest. However, other studies call into question just how strictly we should adhere to this. One study, for example, found meaningful improvements in athletes using 30, 60, and 120-second rest periods. There was no significant difference between those groups. That said, going longer during inter-serial rest periods still makes a lot of sense and is generally standard practice. The argument for longer rest periods is that if you don't rest sufficiently, then you won't be able to call upon your max effort when you perform subsequent reps of jumps. That's the key here, max effort. Jumping as high as possible is akin to performing your 1 rep max. You're giving 100%. And this is what you need to do if you want to increase jump height and rapid force production. To jump higher, you need to create the demand for jumping higher by regularly trying to jump as high as possible. Thus, we should also use a similar approach to rest times and number of repetitions as though we were training with max weights. Number of repetitions should be somewhere in the region of 4 to 5 maximum if the aim is to increase jump height, for example, and rest time should be long enough to ensure max effort the next go round. The number of repetitions is also limited by the amount of time we can spend performing a set of plyometrics. After all, this is a form of training that uses the phosphagen-lactic acid or ATP creatine system for rapid energy release. That means we can't maintain good effort for much longer than 10 seconds. How many reps can you cram into that time? To answer that, we must also consider the intraserial rest time. In other words, how long should you pause between each repetition? We already know the answer if we're talking about depth jumps and shock training, 0.2 seconds. Otherwise, the intraserial rest will be determined by the nature of the exercise itself. There is an unavoidable rest period in counter movement jumps, for example. Of course, fatigue also increases the likelihood of injury. This is particularly important in any exercise that involves leaping off of heights and absorbing large amounts of shock. Should the athlete slip or allow their knee to collapse inwards, it's game over. This is true in general when using plyometrics, and especially things like box jumps. Make sure that there are no valgus knees and that you are properly absorbing the shock as you land. But it's also important to realise that training plyometrics at higher rep ranges and with less recovery is not pointless, as some would have you believe. For one, this trains the ability to call upon explosive force even in a fatigued state. This, of course, is how we are often required to be explosive in sports and in life. We can also combine plyometrics with strength training. The problem with strength training for increasing running speed is that the ground contact time for a sprinter is around 90 milliseconds. This is not enough time to tap into max strength, and so the rate of force development is more important, the rate at which the sprinter can generate power, the rate at which they can recruit the necessary motor units. It's combining plyometrics with strength training that could result in the greatest rapid recruitment of type 2X muscle fibers. Complex training, therefore, does exactly that. It combines strength training with a matched plyometric movement. For example, you might perform bench press followed by explosive push-ups, or squats followed by counter-movement jumps. Complex training appears to work via post-activation potentiation. This means that the muscle fibers and nerves are primed for action. This is the same reason that you feel super light jumping after you've been squatting with a weighted vest. The neurons and spinal nerves that coordinate the movement don't return to their previous resting potential, meaning a weaker signal is required to reactivate them. It's also postulated that the actin and myosin within the muscles become more sensitive to calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Generally, it is performed with reps using roughly 85% of the 1 rep maximum, followed by lighter plyometrics. This is an advanced technique though, and not necessary for most people. Plyometric training is not the only way to increase explosiveness. Take the kettlebell swing, for example. Swinging a kettlebell is an example of ballistic training. This is about acceleration and power, but without necessarily including the stretch-shortening component. Does this still build explosiveness? In a word, yes. Anytime you're required to generate force against resistance, and the aim is velocity, you are developing power and explosiveness. More specifically, you're working on rate of force development. This means you're training yourself to recruit muscle fibers quickly, which is what you need when operating in nearly any athletic environment. Even among powerlifters, aiming to move the bar quickly during strength training will recruit more type 2X muscle fibers, which will result in faster strength gains. In short, it's as though you are adding just a little bit extra weight onto the bar. This is also why we see strength athletes using compensatory acceleration. Here they practice using lighter weights on some days, but combine that with greater acceleration to compensate. The Westside barbell system refers to this as the dynamic effort method. Ideally, you should train using 50 to 70% of your 1 rep maximum to increase neural drive, giving you greater control over your strength and allowing you to explode out the bottom of a given movement. And that is why bar speed is such a useful measure too. Coaches look at how quickly an athlete is moving the weight and adjust accordingly. The problem is that when the weight gets too heavy, we're not able to move with enough speed. The intent changes. We're now grinding through the movement. If your squat max is going up, but your vertical is staying the same, try the dynamic effort method. This is also why sprinters training with the sled pull saw improvements in their running speed until they upped the weight to beyond 75% of their body weight. And this is another very important point to consider: relative strength. The lighter you are, the less max strength you need in order to move explosively. It doesn't matter how much you lift, it matters how quickly you can lift your own body weight. What should be standing out to you here is that this is very much a mental game. It's about the intent with which you perform the movement. If you aim to get through a set of push-ups, the result will be very different than if you aim to perform them as quickly and powerfully as possible. It doesn't even matter if you move. You can increase rate of force development using ballistic isometrics too. These involve pushing or pulling explosively against an immovable object as quickly as you can. So you might push against a wall and suddenly give a burst of effort. This could be another effective tool for contrast training too that would minimize fatigue if used correctly. This is also why it can be useful to train using some kind of external cue if you want to develop true explosiveness. Strength is useless in a vacuum, so why not aim to jump on command? Get a spotter to blow a whistle at random intervals. You could even use 2 different tones, but only jump when you hear one of them, in order to learn both reaction and action suppression. This is once again where training goes from theoretical and detached to genuinely useful and applicable. So that's a pretty comprehensive primer on training for explosiveness. I hope you guys found this one useful and interesting. If you did, please leave a like and share it around, that would help me out immensely. Subscribe and hit the notification button if you want to see more like this. If you want to learn more about functional training that can have real-world benefits for athletes and everyone else, then check out my newly published book, Functional Training and Beyond. And thank you so much to all of you for your amazing support since the launch of the book. It's been doing great. If you read it and enjoyed it, please consider leaving a review on Amazon, as that can really help me to get that early momentum going. And if you're looking for a training program that can improve speed, strength, mobility, brain function and more, check out my ebook and training program, Super Functional Training. That's available in the link down below, and there's a discount on right now while so many of us are still in lockdown. Either way, thank you so much again for watching this one, guys, and bye for now.